So we were talking about the end of World War II when we finished the last segment, and I want today to talk about the impact. And it is almost incomprehensible, the level of death and destruction that World War II caused. And it ends on an extremely ominous note, although Americans didn't perceive it in that way. Americans developed an atomic weapon that they used against two cities. So far in human history, the only time atomic weapons have been used in warfare, against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Americans would quickly become aware of the danger of these weapons. Americans felt confident when the U.S. had a monopoly on atomic weapons, but that monopoly will end by 1949. The Soviet Union will develop an atomic weapon, the U.S. will develop hydrogen weapons, and then the Soviets will develop hydrogen weapons as well. And then it becomes an arms race, and a whole generation of Americans are going to be scarred by this possibility of nuclear holocaust in the world. Now, nevertheless, even with that foreboding ending to the war, there's great celebration when the war ends. In all, 72 million soldiers and civilians died in World War II, which lasted totally 1939 to 1945. The U.S. entered in 1941. About half the casualties were women and children. Other countries suffered more than the U.S. The Soviet Union, for instance, lost 20 million people. Poland lost almost 20% of its population. But more than 405,000 Americans died, more than any other war besides the Civil War, in which every casualty was actually an American. And we're going to have quite a shock, although it takes a while to have full impact, when Americans liberate those Nazi concentration camps. The word Holocaust is commonplace to refer to the Nazi extermination of Jews, and by the way, there were millions of other victims in those camps. That term is not used really until the 1960s, and the perception that this mechanized death at the concentration camps and on the battlefronts was a particularly Jewish event, it doesn't develop for a while. Nevertheless, it really will affect race relations. We'll talk about that when we get to the lectures covering the question on civil rights movements after World War II. But it does still, nevertheless, the pictures of the camps do become available. Newsreel photographers film what they find there. And it really does make some Americans reflective on their reaction to Germany during the pre-war years and then during the war, and how we prioritize ending the systemic genocide of not just Jews, but Gypsies, gay people, and other groups. Now, Holocaust stories, as I said in a previous lecture, appear in publications like the New York Times during the war, but often they appear far inside, because very often the newspaper publishers are Jewish and they don't want to prove, they think, what Charles Lindbergh said, that Jews were supposedly lobbying for the war. They don't want to face that accusation. They don't want to deal with the anti-Semitism that might come if that's the perception. And there are people like Lindbergh fanning the impression that Jews were trying to stir up hostility between Germany and the United States. And I want to remind you that I said that there were false stories widely circulated of German atrocities during World War I that led some Americans to be skeptical of the level of death going on in the German concentration camps. In a 1943 survey, only 43% of Americans believed that Hitler was systemically murdering European Jews. By 1942, however, the government was aware that Jews, Gypsies, diseased, people with disabilities, homosexuality, or people who are homosexual, etc., were being systemically killed at these camps. You'd have trains go to the camps. Some people would be immediately sorted out, immediately executed. Others would be worked as slave labor, sometimes worked to the point of death, medically experimented on, etc. And I mean, these images will shock the conscience and shape how people in the West, in Western Europe, in the United States, see what was called quote-unquote Western civilization. This is a camp, the Ebenezer camp. These are the survivors. You can look at them, you can see how underfed they are, how skinny their bodies are. They've been tattooed, and they're there for various reasons. They become targets of Nazi Germany. This gives you a picture. These are wedding rings taken from victims of concentration camps, people killed in the concentration camps. They would systemically strip them of anything of value. Gold teeth were pulled out of the mouths of the people who were gassed. Their rings were taken away when they entered the camp. Their hair was cut to make wigs, and so on. And these are shoes of the victims, mountains of shoes taken away. Many of them baby shoes, children's shoes. Little children too young to work were killed immediately. It was hard for even American Jews to comprehend what was going on during the war. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was Jewish, was given detailed information about the Holocaust from a member of the Polish underground, where much of the Holocaust took place after the Nazis took over Poland. That's where the worst concentration camps, like Auschwitz, were in Poland. He insisted that it wasn't possible. Later on, he said this. He said, "I did not say the man was lying. I said I cannot believe him. There is a difference." A skeptical State Department continued to enforce the harsh restrictions on immigration that had been in place since 1924 and refused to let refugee Jews from Europe into the United States. Only 152,000 Jews had been allowed to enter the U.S. from Germany before World War II, after those 1924 laws were passed. That number dropped to 2,400 by 1944, the year that the war ended. Well, the Russian troops are going to be the first to discover the death camps. At Auschwitz, they get to Auschwitz of February 1945. They're going to encounter living men, women, and children who look like skeletons. Crematoria filled with dust, stacks of bodies, and as I said, piles of empty shoes and eyeglasses, gold fillings, teeth, wedding rings, even cloth made from human hair. The Nazis wanted to make dollar value use of their killing machines. And as I said, all told, the Nazis murder, the most precise numbers, around 5.8 million, 250,000 gypsies, 60,000 gay men and women killed in the camps, plus Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to salute the Nazi flag or salute Hitler because it's against their religious beliefs. Union activists, communists were made to wear red triangles in the camps. Socialists were made to wear red triangles. Here's the impact in the United States. The Nazi Holocaust represented the extreme but ultimately logical conclusion of the racial ideology behind segregation, forced sterilization, immigration restrictions, lynching, and all the other laws passed in the United States before the war. Before the war, it was common for academics to embrace ideas like eugenics. After the war, American intellectuals actually began to question the idea of race itself, which, as we've said many times, is not scientifically valid. Race is not a biological category. Where academics had once seen poverty and Lack of education in black community is a sign of racial inferiority. More academics in the North begin to see these disparities as products of racism and injustice, structures intentionally created. And some academics in the aftermath of the Holocaust began with a louder voice to call for reforms in education, healthcare, and end to discrimination. And all of this is a cure to many of the ills plaguing American society. Change is going to come slowly. During World War II, black soldiers, once again, are going to be assigned to segregated units. They're going to be frequently humiliated and given menial assignments by their white supervising officers. Lloyd Brown, a black soldier during the war, later remembered being denied entry into a restaurant, this is in Texas, while German prisoners of war he was guarding were allowed to eat inside the restaurant. They were marching the POWs to their camp they were going to stay at. The Germans got to eat inside the restaurant, and an American soldier who happened to be black wasn't. Regardless, a white liberal middle-class consensus desiring an end to Southern segregation is going to slowly form in the North, but it's only going to be because of the insistence of black activists. Before the war was over in 1944, the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal argued that World War II represented a watershed moment for American society. He traveled across the country, he observed black-white relations in America firsthand, and he said that not since Reconstruction has there been more reason to anticipate fundamental changes in American race relations. Myrdal believed that several demographic and social changes would reshape black-white relations, most prominently the return of black soldiers home from the war and the mass migration of African Americans from the South to the available industrial jobs in the North. And of course, African Americans, as we've said repeatedly in this class, were involved in the military, enthusiastically. Here are black troops marching. They sign, like in every war, they're disproportionate in their numbers in the military compared to their percentage in the general population. Black people have always been overrepresented, and Latinos are going to be exceptionally overrepresented in the military in this war. And when they do this, they're going to fight for what they call the double V, double victory. They're fighting for democracy and against fascism and racism in Europe, and they want to accomplish the same thing at home. You fight Nazis abroad, they're the racists there. Let's fight the segregationists in the United States. Pittsburgh Courier, a black-owned newspaper, ran that logo during the war. W.B. Du Bois, who we've talked about before, defined the war against Nazi Germany as a war for racial equality, a battle for democracy not only for white folks, but for yellow, brown, and black. 1 million African Americans are going to join the segregated armed services in the United States, with the color line eroding as the war progresses. African Americans are going to be trained for pilots the first time. They're going to be trained on ships with white sailors, and they're going to see extensive combat duty in Europe and in Asia. And they come home and they demand change. Many veterans, many soldiers will be on the front lines of the civil rights movement. Black organizations are going to use the pressures of the war to pressure the federal government to get interested in desegregation. They petitioned the Roosevelt administration to not sign defense contracts with companies that discriminate against blacks. A. Philip Randolph, head of the almost completely African Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, calls for 100,000 African Americans to, quote, march on Washington. Now, there will be a famous March on Washington at the end of the summer in 1963, where Martin Luther King delivers his I Have a Dream speech. That's where the idea originated. Randolph's call for a March on Washington right leading up into the war. Roosevelt doesn't want a big demonstration. He doesn't want to highlight American racial divisions going into the war. So that's why he signs Executive Order 8802, creating a committee on fair employment practices to investigate claims and to prevent anti-black discrimination in the workplace. Randolph calls off the march. So this is going to be a revolutionary period in that term. We're going to see African Americans become engaged in the civil rights struggle as a byproduct of this war, and they're going to change America. One other group that's going to have a real birth as a civil rights, see a real birth as a civil rights movement, and that's going to be the Latinx community. We'll talk about them next time.